Yeah, great. Good evening and welcome. My name is Josh Owen. I'm the Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and the Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. Tonight marks the second event of our Spring 24 Vignelli Design Conversations series presented by Design Milk and RIT's Magic Center and made possible in part by the generosity of RIT alumnus Chris Bailey and Bailey Brand Consulting. I'd like to begin by offering my thanks to RIT's Magic Center and their team of faculty, staff, and students, as well as our interpreters for this evening, Denise Herrera and Jace Rivera, for their work. I'd also like to recognize the work of my esteemed colleague, School of Design visiting lecturer, Javier Viramontes, for his powerful and poetic branding for tonight's lecture and for the series moving forward. His conceptual focus on the topic of ambiguity aligns with a fascinating area of the Vignelli philosophy, as well as with our tactical interests and keeping our materials aligned with our goals. For tonight's lecture, Javier engaged visual communications master's student Olaya Ordieres Ortega to help further develop this work into the motion graphic piece that you see on the screen. Thank you both for extending the Vignelli ethos by using it for inspiration with your important contribution to our work here, Javier and Olaya. Rochester Institute of Technology's Vignelli Center for Design Studies is an international hub for education, research, collaboration, and advocacy, which expands the scope of the programs in the College of Art and Design School of Design. The facility houses the archive of renowned designers Lella and Massimo Vignelli, whose works are icons of international design. The center and archive sit within RIT's College of Art and Design, which was built on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, keepers of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 sovereign nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We honor the land on which RIT was built and recognize the unique relationship that the indigenous stewards have with this land. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of indigenous people that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and reconciling. As stewards of history and content, we must acknowledge and seek to learn from our context, bad and good, ugly and beautiful. This applies to the Vignelli Center as with any archive. The Vignellis taught us that design is a systematic framework for solving the world's most intractable problems. If recent times have taught us anything, it's that while we as humans are adaptable, our societies and systems have flaws. We're at a point when we need to have difficult discussions and work to create a new balance in the world. In this, design must play and continue to play a critical role. As director, I aim to make the Vignelli Center even more accessible and applicable by bringing in stimulating guest contributors from diverse and often underrepresented backgrounds who help us to consider design in continually innovative ways. The Vignelli's design is one philosophy leaves us with the universal message that design can be a lens through which we can envision a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. This evening's guest was recommended to me by my esteemed colleague, Shani Avni, the Ismar David Assistant Curator in RIT's Carey Graphic Arts Collection. I'm grateful to her for her suggestion. To introduce our speaker, I'd like to invite Amelia Hugo Fontenelle, Associate Curator from the Carey Graphic Arts Collection, to the podium, and I thank her in advance for her service tonight in welcoming our guest.
Thank you so much. As Josh says, I'm Amelia Fontenelle. I'm a curator at the Rare Book Library here at RIT called the Carey Graphic Arts Collection. And I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing our guest tonight, Faride Mereb. Faride is an award-winning book designer, researcher, art director based in New York City via Venezuela. She has worked with companies including Penguin Random House, Kenning Editions, Cuban artists around the world, Ugly Duckling Presse, and many more. She was a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and she currently directs her own design studio and publishing house, Letra Muerta, Inc., which the Carey Collection is a collector of her publications. And this studio is in Brooklyn. Faride is an active member in the American Printing History Association, the Bibliographical Society of America, and the New York Center for the Book, where she has taught many classes. Now, on a personal note, I see a lot of students in the audience tonight, and I hope that through your work, you get to find people who just get you. You know, like you share a personal connection with them that transcends your working situation. Well, I found myself in that situation early in 2021 when Faride and I served on a committee to plan the annual American Printing History Association conference. All of those meetings were on Zoom, and despite that digital barrier and even the age barrier or the cultural barrier or the geographic barrier and those differences, I knew I wanted to be friends with her and soak in the creative energy that you're about to experience tonight. And incidentally, I have to say, we were successful on that committee as we created the first bilingual Spanish and English conference in that organization's 50-year history, reminding people that the term American in the American Printing History Association was not just for North Americans, but for South and Central Americans, for Mexicans, Caribbean peoples, and any Latinx people in the world. So please give a warm welcome for Ms. Faride Mereb.
So I'm honored to be here, and I just want to get something awkward out of the way, which is the way you pronounce my name. So my dad is Lebanese and my mother is Venezuelan. And before I start talking, I'm going to teach you how to properly pronounce my name. So can you repeat after me? So fa, ri, de, Faride. And if you're my grandma, Farida. So if there is anything you do not understand because of my accent, let me know and I will clarify in the end, because I know some things might happen while I'm talking. Maybe it's my imposter syndrome, but ever since I got the invitation to come here for the Vignelli series, I started to wonder why I got invited. And then I started to look into Massimo Vignelli's career, and I started to try to establish parallels with mine. I said, well, you know, we're both immigrants. He always wore black. I always wear black too. He designed the subway map and the system for the subway in New York. I take the subway every day, so it's basically the same thing. And then I saw this photo, and I was like, I am not Massimo Vignelli. And like, dude, me neither. Anyway, I was told that I should share a little bit about my career, a little bit of portfolio projects, and talk a little bit about research as well, so like a remix of what I do. And I want to begin talking about my project Letra Muerta. Letra Muerta started in Venezuela as a publishing house in 2014. And under this imprint, many research-based projects got published. Like this first one, with text by Millo Estrini, a Venezuelan author. And it took me only 8 years of research. The book played a little bit with the idea of the manuscript or handwritten document versus the anonymity of the typed text. So you can see this as an example. It was bound as a French fold. Some people call this also a Japanese binding, which meant the pages were printed only on one side and then folded. This made possible to print the forage of the book as well. It was all conformed of unpublished text, And this was also an author that had not been published in over 20 years. And after 6 months, the book sold out. This was a self-financed short print run book. This led to a publisher in the US, Canning Editions, to reach out to me, and they wanted to print a very much larger print run in English. The book got translated by Cassandra Gillick and Anne Boyer, who, by the way, won the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction in 2020. So you could imagine my surprise when I saw this little book that I had printed only 500 copies of, out of pocket, paid in parts, did research, you know, I was gonna curse, sorry. I was gonna say pull out of my ass, but I didn't say. The book made top 10 of small press distribution for several months. So that to me was a success. It also made compilations in magazines, like A Public Space. It also got included in a compilation by MIT Press. And then it even got translated to French, which was the birth country of Mio Estrini. And then in France, the book sold out in the first 3 months of circulation, and now we're making a reprint. So back then, in 2015 in Venezuela, I collected all of that money from the first book, and I made a second one. This is the second book, but I will tell you more about this further on. Then this was the third book, same principle, collected all the money, printed this. This is an experimental book with poems by Ida Grambo, also a Venezuelan poet. So you can see there's a constant of me working with women. It's because I tend to work with people that were often, whose stories were often neglected, and sad but true, most of them were women. This was composed of 2 volumes, one of which was a miniature, wanting to honor the printer Tulio Febres Cordero, and the main volume had 4 different kinds of paper denoting the different writing stages from 1947 to 1952. Some of the layouts, some of the layouts were very experimental. Here are some details you can see of how the typography and the materiality were very intertwined. Like vellum paper was used, and the way that the text was weaved was made possible because of overlapping. Then, Espacios para decir lo mismo by Venezuelan author Hani Oso. Her family, also immigrants. You could read on this book each language side by side. Great. You could read it kind of like scriptorium mode, side by side, or only one language at a time by using the hinges in the middle. All the styles of this book were created using Optima Nova. The book had 3 spines and what sometimes is known as a French binding. So this book also seeked a connection between herself and her mother. If you see on the right, there's 2 passport photos, because it was said that when she began writing, it was because of her mother's death at a very young age. So one of my challenges as a designer was to mirror the layout and work, made it fit within 2 different languages. So as you can imagine, if you have laid out books in several languages, in this case, it was, the Latin alphabet, but in Spanish, sentences tend to be very much longer than in English. So having the same color on the page was quite hard. I had already been doing research for over a year in Venezuela for this project called The Private Life of Ragdolls by poet Aquiles Nazoa, who died in the 70s. And fast forward, in 2018, I was already living in New York, and the book finally got printed with the same printer from 1976. There were inserts inside of the book, printed offset, and in Bible paper. This book got selected as a feature artist project by Center for Book Arts for an exhibit. So that's how I began my relationship with the center. So as you can see, one thing led to the other. Like a self-financed small book led to financing in another country, then a competition, and then so on. We also created a font for the end papers based on cross-stitch, and this was made possible with the help of designer Mirko Velimirovic. You can see that detail. It even says the title of the book with a font, and it has ornamentation. This specific pattern was created by my husband, Samuel, who's in the audience. Samuel. Part of what I am interested in is experimenting with dimensions, and this is very much reflected in the book as well. I see contrast between the archival grain equality of the images and Victorian sharp modernist geometric nature of fonts, like haptic in this case by really type. Alongside all the archival books, contemporary books were also published, like this one that ended up becoming a whole series based on color. The continuity of the series was made by a Spot Inc. And in this case, this particular book won AIGA 50 books, 50 book covers in 2019. And so on. Then I made more projects for clients, like the experimental cover for a photo book. Here are some of the layouts. These are some landscapes in Caracas. All of these were 35mm photos, printed offset in duotone. Another book, also bilingual in Spanish and English, which is what I get hired the most to do. If you can see the silhouettes of each of the booklets are printed in varnish. More details. This book ended up becoming an exhibit. Now, jumping ahead, after the Aquiles Nazoa, Vida Privada de las Muñecas de Trapo, este proyecto quedó seleccionado con una invitación de co-curaduría para la ciudad de Washington, D.C. para participar en Washington Project for the Arts. Esto fue en conjunto con la abogada especialista en derechos humanos, Fabiola Delgado, y una organización sin fines de lucro. Lo que ven aquí son puros facsímiles de mi pasaporte venezolano. For that exhibit in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I worked on a mail project where I created the exact copy of my passport and mailed it to 300 people. I invited people to talk about their families and their migration stories. I found this very much needed. Sorry, just when I talk about this project, I'm like, I found this very much needed in a time of not only isolation, but in a time where Venezuelans were being denied of passport renewals and proper documentation as a way to control the migratory crisis. Many people sent the passports back with interventions, as you can see here. Oh my God, sending those passports, I used to say like 10 minutes at a time. They didn't fit through the slots of the mail. Others just sent their digitization by mail, and they shared their story with me. Here I'm sharing anonymously. For example, someone says from Palestine to Kuwait. Another one reads, I have many reasons, but mainly my sexual orientation. And like that, many other stories from people in Korea, from people in Vietnam, for people who were born in the Dominican Republic. And then there was a big glitch. Oh, I learned glitch is a Yiddish word. I learned that today. Go figure. So after the pandemic, once I got my green card, I was left with a huge debt because of my lawyer bills. And once I got my green card and COVID hit, so a lot of things happened. So while I was teaching, I was also doing consulting for companies. And there was a brief moment that for a little over a year, I worked in a tech company. I know. I worked in a tech company and I art directed photo shoots, created merch. I also got to work hiring designers for different purposes, content creation. And one of the most fun projects I worked on was a font project. This ended up being an open source project on Google Fonts that we ended up extending to mono and italic variable fonts. This was designed by Evan Sorkin and Mirko Velimirovic, and I had the honor to give feedback during the process and do project management until the project completion. Okay, end of the glitch. After that period, I was stable enough to go back on track and open a small design studio in Williamsburg, in the city. A collaborative space where I share with other Latina women. Here you can see my business partner, Oriana, and Zuleika, who we share the studio with because rent in New York is super expensive. This is one of the projects we made in the studio. How can I see my time? There's too many numbers and I can confuse. How much time have we been talking for?
It's 5:52.
5:32?
52.
20
52.
minutes so far.
Okay, perfect. This is a project we made that I'm particularly proud of, Crania, by a writer, Laura Salas Hernandez. And while doing research for this book, we encountered bibliographical sources that were both uplifting and discouraging, many of them with very racist perspectives based on phrenology, and which had devastating consequences on the history of medicine and other histories as well. To this day, unethical practices reign in different fields, and many institutions and museums continue to choose how to display, preserve, and study human remains in questionable ways, especially skulls. The first section of the book includes images with some literary and historical references mentioned on the text. These were all printed in varnish. So varnish was treated like a spot color, basically. And this varnish was also applied in the outer margins, emphasizing how books oxidize with time and giving it a warm sheen. Formally, the book is meant to be perceived as a medical guide of sorts, or a small encyclopedia. The pages lie flat with a medical precision. That's how I branded it. It's sold, so. We wanted to evoke the rawness of the text in the binding details, the sewing, the thread, and the exposed spine with printed signatures, as you can see here. The font used for this project was Public Sans and Labrada by Mercedes Guarregui in omnibus type. They're in Argentina. We wanted the contrast of the two foundries that each focus on different languages, one in Spanish and specifically indigenous languages because of the extended diacritics, and one for English. One might think that there's a fixed relationship between languages and typographic styles in this book, but the truth is that as the book evolves, the lines often blur and make it hard to tell which language has predominance. This is another project that we developed for Pauline Shapiro. We worked a lot with die cutting, font typesetting. We also printed and bound this, and we had a lot of fun with the photo shoot. So we also take on smaller projects that have less extensive text and only involve one language in the studio. Here, for example, are some pages from another book we co-designed. This is the story of DFA records, compiled in 2007. And this we all laid out in a monospaced font to evoke that first internet wave vibe. Another part of the book, the spreads are in the shape of the DFA logo. Well, legally, we cannot use the DFA logo, so let's keep that a secret. Give me 1 second. So English is hard. Should I switch to Spanish for a little bit? Otra gran parte de lo que hacemos en el estudio es curar colecciones para bibliotecas e instituciones. Desde archivos completos hasta selecciones muy específicas de libros y publicaciones que son muy importantes para la construcción de nuevos cánones y para repensar la historia de lo que conocemos como diseño. Por ejemplo, aquí hay una selección de publishers o prensas latinoamericanas independientes que compilamos para una universidad. So another big part of what we do is curate collections for libraries and institutions, from whole archives by designers to selections of books that we find important for scholarship and the rethinking of the design canon, like this selection, for example, from independent Latin American presses. Why is it not? Okay. Or this international protest graphic collection of books that is multilingual, or this decentralizing design and protest graphics that is based on different writing systems other than the Latin alphabet, or the work of specific Latin American or Latinx artists like John Vázquez Mejías and his series on the Puerto Rican War, which explores the relationship of the USA and Puerto Rico because of the way that the US has treated Puerto Rico, which is part of the USA. Or specific cases of collections like Imprenta Rescate from Argentina, which work we find really important not only because of their multiple printing techniques, but their re-editing or influential history of printing text in Argentina and Latin America, like the work of Raúl Mario Rosario. Those of you who are print freaks or geeks know how hard it is to find Rosario books. So the fact that they re-edited this and printed it letterpress, to me, is just a huge deal. Here are some details that make up part of the artifacts in the collection, like this shofar that also helps us notice the influence of Jewish culture in Argentina after the massive exodus of the war, for example. And now let's talk about Re. Re is a current exhibition that we have up in Bedford in a gallery called Miriam. In this exhibition, we are trying to highlight the processes and work we're doing at the studio. This is a photo of the exhibit. This goes from what we do with book design to archival work to the digitizing we're currently doing for our community. There is also a multimedia wall with some of the content we have digitized so far from 8mm film. And the idea is to eventually upload free resources online for researchers. So in the case of the exhibit, we can see here the originals from Morrocoy Azul, which was a surrealist newspaper. And on this side, we can see facsimile that we printed so every visitor could take it home and read it. So the idea is to go beyond the printed facsimile and upload all these images eventually. We also have a display with objects where we play with the idea of how personal experience and free association permeates in the work that we do. Enlarged facsimile, where we explore concepts of dimension, scale, and people also get to see the details from the type of printing that was used for each publications to small details in the writing of the authors. Besides the film, you can see a QR code in the table that people would scan with their phones. And one of the things we do in the studio a lot is create databases. So we wanted to create a new approach for this, and we made an Airtable with an extra field with a label for the experience or the memory associated with each object. So alongside fields like title, description, measurement, technique, you also had a field for memory, which is something that in oral tradition, in cultures like mine that are mostly oral tradition based, get lost. Moving into research, like before wasn't research, I want to talk a little bit about Carmela Leizaola. How am I on time?
28 minutes.
I have what?
You are at 28 minutes, you're fine.
You're at 28.
Okay. Carmela Leizaola was the first woman graphic designer in Venezuela registered to this day. I was lucky to win a grant awarded by 10 by 10 photo books, in this case by women, with a grant in 2021 to expand on this research. And I made a publication composed of 3 volumes. As you can see, here's the evolution of her as a kid. Well, she wasn't working back then, but you know what I mean. And then in the middle, when she was working in Tipografía Vargas, and then when she was a badass smoking when she was old. Getting used to the craft. This is a bit of process of the first dummy. One of the publication's highlights was that it had a timeline. And although I don't see myself handling history in a linear manner, this was built thanks to the credits that appear on publications, interviews, testimonial sources, photos, and certificates provided by her family. You have no idea how much work was not credited for her and other women back then. Some of the work I got to credit because I saw photos of her on the social pages of the magazine. For example, if we were to analyze what I just showed you, in red you see professional, well, in magenta, coral, whatever. You see professional highlights. The parts that are in black, you see all of her biography and personal life details. And in the bottom in green, political context. And that political context context helped guide the meaning of everything that was above, like the reason she traveled, why she went this or that place. Here's one of her spreads for Revista Imagen in the 60s. Honestly, I wish I could do this entire talk about her, not talk about myself. This also ended up becoming a small show in NYC. People got to read the newspapers, take them. There were stickers that you can take that had QR codes that led you to issue pages where you can read the publication for free. We also created a website that not only shared those issue links with the 3 volumes, but also created a Wikipedia page. That first page was in Spanish. Someone later reached out to me and created the page in English. And we also created links for a shop where we shipped publications internationally. You had no idea how much family this woman had. It's crazy. Now, Victor Viano's research, which is how I think I'm going to wrap up this conversation, is part of my Design and Migration series. I know a lot of the work I've been talking about has a lot to do with migration, but this specifically I titled this way to make it sound nicer, more interesting. Design and Migration series. I divided the work in 3 areas. His life in Argentina, where he was born, his first migration and shift to editorial work when he moved to Venezuela. And those of you who are from Venezuela are going to have a kick out of the images coming up. And later, his years in Spain. Victor was born in Rio Primero, Córdoba in 1939. He was the son of Argentinians and Italian immigrants. This type of work that I do regarding migration is because I also try to emphasize the relevance of designers' personal experience and political context in their work. And that not only relates to identifying visual cues for the sake of aesthetics, but also how everything regarding from context to personal experience came across in their work. Coming from Venezuela and being an immigrant myself, it is hard to separate how politics had influenced the nature of our work, either by technical limitations or scarcity. And for example, remember this book from the beginning of the talk? This was printed in a very fancy Bible paper. It was hand bound. It had calico iris, German cloth on the spine. And when we were about to create the cover for it, there were not importings of materials were not happening in the country because of political conflict. So we received a donation of a pizza box die cut company and created all of the covers with pizza boxes. So this book ended up being a hybrid of this exquisite material in the gut and a highly acid cardstock in the cover. And that to me is a reflection of the country in a book. Okay, back to Victor. His story begins in Argentina and his formal studies in illustration and art. Here we can see some of his character studies for movement and even his report card from back then. He studied under the mentorship of Enrique Vietes. And in the back you can see some portraits he did later in his life. I know because that ended up being his wife. His artistic career developed mostly by being self-taught. You can see that in this newspaper. Here you can see some examples of shows he had. And he also worked as a graphic designer for Canal 10. Here are some details for invites. There was no credit here, but based on the aesthetic quality of it, I'm sure that he designed this himself. Vian also won a scholarship that allowed him to travel to the British Council for an office for the BBC in 1966. And this is how some of his drawings look back then. This is kind of like his darker age. He also resorted to illustrations with acrylic paint and letra set to create pieces for various advertisements. Here we can see the desfile de modelos in Casa Fernandez. And finally, here's some of his work for Canal 10. He worked in this time with another professional called De Lorenzi. And in 1966, there was a coup, and Arturo Umberto Illia was taken out of presidency, and General Juan Carlos Onganía replaced him in a military dictatorship in Argentina. So since the country was in really bad shape, Victor migrated. His arrival in Venezuela was in 1968 and was a result of him winning a contest in his hometown in Argentina for the position of art director in Ricardo de Luca Advertisement, which was a renowned agency. And brace yourselves, because what's coming after this, it's kind of like an episode of Drunk History. By then, Ricardo de Luca did all the advertisement for Gillette. It kind of looked like this. And he later left advertisement completely to dedicate himself almost fully to editorial design. I am sure many of you are aware, but Venezuela is the largest oil-producing country in the world. One of the few things I could mention that could evidence this, there's a video of Jackie Kennedy speaking Spanish in Venezuela. And although it was not the exact same year as Victor's arrival, it gives context to the crazy things happening in the country once democracy began. Venezuela ended up becoming a founding member of the OPEC in 1960. So, let me play the video.
Me alegro haber podido acompañar a mi marido a Venezuela. La distinción y la importancia de vuestra cultura ya me eran conocidos. También me han impresionado vuestros esfuerzos.
She speaks better than J-Lo, to be honest. I will not judge her. Victor worked for several publishing houses, for example, Monteavila Editores. This was founded by Simón Alberto Consalvi. He did not only books, but holiday cards, catalogs, a lot of printed material, and everything was printed in Editorial Arte. Here are some of the amazing covers he did for Editorial Arte, for Monteavila printed in Editorial Arte. Most of them were poetry, each had different characteristics, and one of the things that stuck with me the most is that we had the possibility to publish international authors and translations in Venezuela. And currently we don't even have the power to import books printed in other countries talking about ourselves because we cannot publish our own people. Some of the things I discovered by looking at his work was that he incorporated drawings, his own drawings in the covers, and he also resorted to repetition of images to portray movement. He also used his own image in many cases. You know, there was like no Getty images or, you know. So he used a lot of his work and his influences from art school to accomplish this. And I want you all to take a moment to read this quote. May not only be heard abroad the brilliant melody of our oil. This is a catalog for books. So this reeks of oil money. Here are some other examples of Tiempo Nuevo and Universidad Simón Bolívar. And while he was doing all of the editorial work, he continued to develop his drawing. Here is an example of some covers and pages for Revista Nacional de Cultura. This is an engraving with a drawing of this, and this was part of his blue drawing series. How am I on time? Sorry?
40 minutes.
40? Okay, I'm wrapping up, I promise. So a decade before Viano arrived, dictatorship had ended, like I said, and the 70s was a huge decade for the country since Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized oil, the oil industry. What was mostly managed by people from abroad, including the Rockefellers in Venezuela, now belonged to Venezuelans. But unfortunately, later in his second term, the country went to ruins and infrastructure had decayed because agriculture and tourism were almost extinct. They were not invested upon. And this led to a crash of the country. Just for reference, this is an avocado that grew in my mother-in-law's backyard. Look at the hand for scale. It's like a small child's head or something. And this makes me wonder that if this is possible and this happens today in a backyard, what a non-extractivist model of economy would do for a country like mine. By 78, some problems had started in the country, so he decided to leave to Spain. There he married Luisa Antonioli, an architect. They had 2 children. He started to dedicate himself mostly to branding, more portfolio of his branding. He also designed other printed material, including posters and brochures for Claudio Alberto Gambino. And one of the later stages in his work was what led me in the first place to do this research. I asked online in 2017, you can see here, I was trying to figure out who made the logo for Ediciones Mandorla. And a couple of years later, I had the original pay stubs in my hands. There are only 2 books in my country that talk about Venezuelan design. Both were oil funded, and one was published in the 80s and the other in the 90s. Nothing has happened ever since, only small efforts. Here are some of Mandorla covers. The ornamented margins came from Esquedé manuals. Here are some of the pages that refer to, you can see one of his pay stubs, and then an example of page 15 from the manual from 1768. More Monte Avila. He also designed the logo for Paidos. This logo is still used today in Latin America. So Victor died in the year 2000, and the importance of Llanos' work relies not only in how he began as an artist and then transitioned into more commercial work, but how advertisement managed to help him migrate and switch to publishing, industry that was very lucrative back then because of oil funding. I grew up in Venezuela looking at amazing covers that were designed and printed before I was born, and most of these covers had credited Viano as a designer. In 2019, I wrote an article for alphabets.org, which was kind of like the beginnings of this work. And through the article, they contacted me from Córdoba because they found out more about Viano's work. So from something that I published doing research in Venezuela and living in New York, people from their hometown ended up finding new resources. And this is part of the show. I even went to his house and looked through his books, his archive. His wife gave me a bunch of stuff to digitize. It took us a little over a year to restore, catalog, and work with everything. And a large part of Viano's archive was recently acquired by Toronto University and is now part of the Fisher Library of Rare Books. We made this little video to celebrate. So all of the physical material is now being preserved. People can make visits, have access to it. We also digitized everything, and it will be available online soon. And that's something that for someone that was not known makes me really proud. Here's a small publication that we made with Catherine Small Gallery. I wrote a little bit about Victor. Here are some images. There are many more images waiting to be shown. After the archive got acquired, I got so excited that one of the drawings from the Revista Nacional de Cultura, I got it tattooed. Because I felt like I wanted to carry part of the archive with me. And after all, keeping memories doesn't necessarily have to follow a methodology, which is why I call myself a half-ass scholar, because I always do everything adjacent to academia. And I would like to see these works that I do as seeds, the beginning of something that can be bigger, that can be better. And hopefully these two researches, the Carmela Leizaola and the Victor Viano one, can become into a more comprehensive publication or a bilingual book. But for now, I plant as many seeds as I can, and I hope for people to come after me to help me write these stories. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
So we have time for some questions.
I think I talked too much and everyone's tired. Sorry.
Yeah, right here.
So just from your experience, the political situation in Venezuela and your background, do you apply that to your works that you continue doing, such as the protests and all those different? Do you show what's happening actually right now, currently in Venezuela? Or would you be doing any kind of activity of showing what's happening now, currently in Venezuela?
Well, I think every one of us can act as a propagator or as a means to propagate ideas from our own fields. So in my case, that represents itself in my work as, you know, the passport, which are also books, or the exhibits, where I also talk about the negligence in the country through the state of archives. I don't participate actively in street protest. My protest comes more from a doing point of view, from making, but definitely work regarding, like I do a lot of volunteering in shelters. So the experience I get from sharing with other Venezuelans that came to the US under different conditions that mine definitely influenced the work. That's from my personal experience. I also think that my work is very much permeated by tradition from a non-colonial perspective. Venezuelans have a huge tradition of bookmaking, and I was kind of like raised under the wing of Venezuela's most important printer, and he taught me a lot of what I know. I mean, I went to college, but that didn't matter. I learned by making at the press. So I feel that my work definitely reflects this aesthetic tradition from my country and my experience while moving here. Definitely more resources here and more. Well, there's electricity, water. So.
There's a question over here.
Can you talk about your experience, like personally with printing? What kind of printing do you like doing the most, and do you have any personal projects? And what of these books did you print yourself?
Well, I actually took out the ones I print myself because I thought that would be boring. I was gonna get into the nitty-gritty of the production. In Venezuela, I learned offset printing. I was not actually working the press, but I was working with the press workers. So I installed plates, I put ink, I would check tests, I would do the check the maculaturas, which I don't know how to say in English, all of that. And I worked in pre-press, so I learned a lot about image retouching, both from working in a newspaper and working directly in an offset press. Here in the US, in Venezuela, there was no letterpress printing because that's very expensive, believe it or not. The maintenance of the machines, everything. So I did see sort of museums of letterpress in different private workshops, but non-working machines. So here in the US, with the help of several people, I have managed to print several projects, but I have never printed on my own. So I always have someone like, maybe it's insecurity because I basically print everything, but I have someone by me, like guiding me. In the studio, we have a Xerox. In the Xerox, we have printed many publications, posters. We have hosted workshops. We also have a large Epson where we do giclée and we do maquettes or dummies for books. So yeah, digital printing. Offset is my favorite. I would love to learn how to use a Heidelberg, like the one that's here, wink wink. Yeah. We also do binding.
Question here.
Your books are absolutely beautiful, and I think that the photography does an amazing job capturing the essence of them as well. And I was wondering if there was a process that you undertake when you're photographing the books, or what that process might look like to capture their essence.
Yeah, so I put on boxing gloves and I call my husband because he's the most amazing photographer, but the most stubborn person in the world. So every time we take the photos, we end up fighting. But I try to calm myself by later realizing that the photos were worth it. The process is mostly based on what I think is valuable. The photographic process is mostly based on what I think is valuable from the book. What took me the most time in making, what I think would interest other people when holding the book, what I want to highlight from the binding to a specific texture to a shimmer from an ink. I want it to be very sensorial. I don't know how to say in English, like sensory. I want it to be very sensory. And I don't agree. Some people say, oh my God, you do book objects. I don't believe that. I believe that the book is an experience in itself. It shouldn't be thought of as like this thing that sits on a desk. And it should be touched, smelled, and experienced. So I do include a lot of like Easter eggs and different kind of tactile things within the books. And my goal is for every book that I do from now on, even if it's in the US, to do it bilingually, because I not only want people in the US to understand the stories I'm telling, I want the people from my country to also be informed of things we don't know about ourselves, we didn't know about ourselves. So yeah, it's very much about material and sense. What was the word?
Sensory.
Sensory.
Question right here.
So I know you talked about liking to experiment a lot with the styles and whatnot that you use in creating the physical books, but is there really any sort of style or approach that you haven't really tried yet that you really want to? Whether it's something that's trying a new textile material or just trying a different typographic approach or anything, like really just anything that you haven't tried that you are like super excited or really want to try out.
Yeah, and I think about it every day. It's Arabic. I want to lay out in other writing systems because so far I've only laid out in the Latin alphabet and glimpses of Hebrew and Arabic here and there for books. But my family's from Lebanon, for God's sake, and I don't know how to speak the language, so I want through my making to get in touch with that side of my father's family. And I think more of us should engage with other writing systems, not only the Latin alphabet, because that will expand, our processes and our making. If you see the history of design, they never teach you words like Reza Abedini or Wild Morcos or, I don't know, Nadine Shaheen. They always teach you like Paul Rand, or Vignelli, who I love, but, So where are all these other people that could possibly be enriching the work that we're doing? And maybe they're not in the language that is your mother tongue,
There was a question over there.
So are you planning in future publication and books to include stories of other designers that come from other countries to kind of expand what you were saying about like coming in touch with more cultures?
Yes. So right now I'm looking for funding to make the Carmela Leizaola project into a book, and the Victor Viano project into a book, because I got like more than 2,000 images from the process of research, and I think it would be valuable to share them. Not only digitally, but also compiled into a book, so it's in archives, it's in universities, people can touch it and stuff. In my case, I specialize in Latin American designers and literary authors, as you saw, which are influenced by design. But I would be more than open to invite other people to tell me about their stories and, create a project for that. But yeah, my focus is mostly women in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's already a lot of the other stuff,
Oh, question in front.
I'm really curious to know if you find any differences or maybe a different design approach between projects that you have personally researched and projects that the clients that you're only the designer of the content?
Well, it's crazy because I have found, and this is an advice that I would give to everyone who's here that's a student, also not student. When you self-initiate projects, that encourages other people to want to make something similar. So a lot of clients come to me because they saw something that I made up, and they want to do something similar for an author they're working with, and although each project has its own characteristics because it's obviously nurtured by the content, it's not something, gratuitous. I do think that the more if you're constantly making, the right people will find you. So I have been lucky enough to have commercial or client projects where I get to experiment. Another thing, unfortunately, awards don't mean anything, but if you have them, people trust you more. They're like, oh, she's not full of shit. So they trust you more in the design process, and they listen to you more, or at least, I don't know, I've been lucky to have clients that listen to me. There was a question in the back, but
I just had a really quick technical question about the pages that you print with a varnish. Do those continue to patina and yellow over time, or do you find that they crackle? I assume so. Okay,
they don't crackle because for several reasons. First, you cannot apply varnish to an uncoated paper, and what you see that's uncoated that has varnish, usually it's matte coated or it's printed on top of CMYK or other spot colors. In this case, this is a matte coated paper, and the varnish is based on percentages. So if you want to get into the nerdy side of it, we made tests from 15% to 55%, 75%, and 100% of varnish. And I got tests from the press, and what I noticed was that although the 55, 75 looked very elegant, the yellowing process was going to be slower. And since my books are short print runs, I think that for the time span of 10 years, I wanted people to be able to notice the yellowing of the pages. That was treated kind of like throughout the book like a duotone in pre-press. It was only black and varnished. And there was one signature for 16 pages that was CMYK plus varnish, which was illustrations in the middle. I don't know if you remember. And they were not applied like a rectangle, or you can do, when you apply varnish, you can do it based on the same image that you're printing with a different percentage, like it was another ink to create a CMYK and quadrichromia. You can do, see, people are going away.
I love printing, Tom.
Yes.
Mom, I'm sorry.
Do it. You love printing, Tom.
So, in my case, I didn't want to do that because I wanted to highlight specific parts of the images. So what I did is I silhouetted certain parts and created 100% of varnish in several parts of the book. That for big blacks, which was certain diacritics throughout the book, or certain quotes that were really big, and I didn't want it to look washed out in coated paper. And for the image portion and the beginning of the book. So it's something you see a lot with light, and it's very tactile. There's also a debossing on the cover, so everything's like really bone oriented. Or
We'll take one last question.
And Carrie has that book Crania, so please come visit the Carrie collection so you can see it. But my question, I noticed that you're the rights manager for two archives that are not Leozola or Viano. What is that?
no, I'm the state for Millo Vestrini and Hani Osod, which are writers.
Mm-hmm.
For Viano and Carmela, I help manage the reproduction of the images, and I'm currently in the works with both families to place in other collections other parts of their work. Like for Viano, the part we placed in Toronto was the Venezuelan part, like part of the Argentina and Venezuela. but I still have the Barcelona and Madrid part of the collection, including drawings and a lot of personal drawings and sketches and notes. And that I'm beginning to digitize within the next month. So then we will look where to locate that. In the case of Carmela, it's a bit harder because Carmela didn't migrate with her archives like Victor. Carmela, part of it is in Venezuela, part of it is in Argentina, part of it is in Madrid, and part of it doesn't exist. I only have seen like reproductions of it or like film, you know, the ones you put on the little machines for the newspaper. Or I have looked at where she worked from this era to this era, and I looked newspaper by newspaper to see what I find with her credit. So physical archive of Carmela is very small and very dispersed, but I do have the digital images. That's mostly like images.
Well, let's thank Faride for an excellent talk. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening and look out for our final Design Conversations talk of the academic year next month with Teresa Fitzgerald, who I'm sure you will all enjoy. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.